It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. So what happened to college? What happened to college? That's the question our next guest, the sociology professor, set out to answer, and the title of his new book. His conclusion, Politics Broke It. Not just Trump administration politics of 2025 and 2026, so we'll get to that, but political polarization more broadly, which he finds has reshaped nearly every part of student life, where students even apply, who their friends are, what they say in class, what they major in, who they date. We'll get to each of those things and invite your own takes and experiences as students, faculty members, and anyone else. I'll give the phone number right now, 212-433 WNYC, because that's enough of a premise to get you all going, I know. 212-433-9692. Call or text. Neil Gross is a professor of sociology at Colby College in Maine. He spent the last 2 years surveying and interviewing hundreds of students and recent grads across the country, and it's all in the book out now called What Happened to College? How Politics Broke Higher Education and What We Can Do to Fix It. Professor Gross, thanks for coming on for your book. Congratulations on the book. Welcome back to WNYC.
Much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
This is a book about polarization, obviously, but you say we use that word imprecisely. So let's start by defining our terms. How do you use the word polarization, and what do you think a lot of people get wrong?
Well, let me start by saying what motivated this book, and then I'll circle back to the polarization piece, if that's all right. So I first started working on this book, as you say, about 2 years ago. This was right after the protests and encampments of 2023 and 24. And something seemed different. I'd worked on this topic for 20 years. I last did my big investigation of it around 2006, 2007. I found back then that some of the claims made by the right about the politicization of higher education were kind of massively overstated. But 2020, 21, 22, 23, it seemed like something had shifted. So I wanted to figure out what was that? Has anything actually changed? I spent a lot of time talking to students at Colby, but I wanted to understand what was happening nationally. So yeah, lots of surveys, as you mentioned, lots of interviews. And what I found was that polarization has really seeped into the college experience writ large. So there's kind of two kinds of polarization that social scientists talk about. One is ideological polarization. People just have views, they disagree more sharply on things. The other is called affective polarization, which is when people with divergent opinions really start to dislike one another and feel that the other side is immoral. They have hostility toward them. And I'm finding that is has become more of a part of the college experience, from affecting student life to what happens in the classroom in ways that are actually pretty damaging.
And so when you say we don't always understand or use correctly the word polarization, is it because we leave out that affective part, the personal part, not just the ideological part?
Yeah, I think that democracies were built for disagreement. That's sort of what they're about. The idea that you should have a society where everyone agrees on everything is, if you have that, then you don't need a lot of the democratic safeguards and procedures that our country and many other democracies were built around. But it's very hard for anything to function properly in a democracy when parties who disagree vehemently dislike one another, have intense hostility to one another. It becomes harder to get things done in government, to get things harder to done at the level of local government, certainly the federal government, and it just gums up the works of society. We're seeing that in society writ large. Certainly the courts have become a site of polarization. We're seeing a lot of that in the news media. And what I found after investigating what's happening on college campuses is that a lot of the changes that people have been talking about in higher ed really are also just the result of higher education being put through the ringer of polarization. And it's pushing students apart. So they often don't have much of an opportunity to interact with or befriend people who disagree with them. And they begin to form stereotypes of the other side that are pretty hurtful and damaging long term.
And so again, listeners, as we get ready to go deeper with Neil Gross on some of the particulars that he just listed, listeners with any current or recent connection to college life, How do you see political polarization, ideological polarization, affective polarization affecting student life? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Parents and students weigh in on where you or your kids even chose to apply. And if you took these kinds of things into account, who you or their friends are, who you or other people choose to date, what you feel comfortable saying in class, what you choose to major in. Again, we'll get to each of those things as we invite your own takes and experiences as students, faculty members, parents, recent grads, or anyone else. Help Neil Gross and us report this story at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. So, Neil, you cite two competing stories about what went wrong, a conservative one and a progressive one. Your answer to which is correct is both and neither. You use those words. So start with the conservative diagnosis. What's the case conservatives make?
I think conservatives have been upset at the direction of higher education in this country for a long time. The modern conservative movement really started in the 1950s with William F. Buckley writing this book, God and Man at Yale, which was a critique of what he saw as the liberal and secular tendencies of his professors when he was a student there. And that's grown over the years. I think in recent years, the conservative diagnosis is that higher education has been taken over by the progressive left, dominated by progressive faculty members who, in the conservative diagnosis, are thrusting their views down the throats of students and corrupting them. That's the conservative diagnosis. There are other components of that, too, including the idea that there's been too much of a growth of an administrative apparatus on college campuses, particularly when concerned with diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations, and in their view, that's transformed college in pretty negative ways. So that's the position from the right.
That's the position from the right that makes a lot of news on a regular basis, that particular set of critiques. So now lay out the progressive diagnosis. When people on the left say higher ed is in crisis, what's their story? How does that contribute to how do they see their version contributing to this polarization? And compare it to the conservative arguments.
I think the progressive diagnosis is twofold. First of all, the idea is that college is too expensive, and there are of course plenty of conservatives who also agree that college is too expensive. College is too expensive. But certainly many on the left feel that it has become so expensive that many people who could really benefit from going to college are unable to, or are forced to go to colleges that don't really provide the kind of value for their money that they should be trying to get. That's of great concern, and I think that is linked to the second consideration that many on the left raise, which is that higher education is in difficult straits today because of attacks from the right. The Trump administration attacks on higher education, on elite schools, but also on science and scientific research is part of that. But there's also a concern on the left that governors, particularly in red states, have been defunding higher education over the years, and that's partly why the costs of going to school are so high now, because the costs of attendance have been shifted onto the backs of students and their parents. So the diagnosis from the left is that the right is the problem, and the diagnosis from the right is that the left is the problem.
And you give your own take on this in the book, like what each side gets right and wrong in your opinion, right?
I do. So this book is intended to be a resource for parents and students wherever they stand on the political spectrum. So it's not really a political book in the sense that I'm not trying to advance a particular political argument here. It's really more a deep dive into what the college experience is like across different kinds of colleges and for different kinds of students. But the argument that I make is that colleges have been, as I said, sort of overrun by polarization. And we, speaking as someone who's part of higher education, haven't done enough to resist that. College doesn't work very well in the context of polarization. We really need a strong degree of bipartisan support to fund the higher education apparatus, to fund academic science. And colleges have lost the trust and faith of a surprising number of members of the public, and we haven't done enough to combat that. We've too often leaned into polarization. Some schools have carved out reputations for themselves as places you would go, if you were a progressive activist. Other schools carved out reputations as places you would go if you're on the right. Other schools, place you'd go if you're not that interested in politics. And that's understandable. Every school is going to market itself differently. But in so doing, we've created political bubbles that are damaging for the student experience. And we've also undermined the sense in the public that what we're doing matters and is important. And so to the extent that there is a strong kind of policy argument, it's an argument really about the direction that higher education should go.
Let's take a phone call. Ross in Portland, Oregon. You're on WNYC. Hi, Ross.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I'm a recent college graduate after taking 30 years off. So I'm reflecting on the analog experience of college in the late 80s and early 90s. And I worked on a radical student newspaper at the University of Oregon in the analog age. And we seem to now, in the almost exclusively digital age, react so quickly and have so little time to digest the information that comes at us and reflect on how we feel about it. And instead of having human to human interactions, we're like instantaneously driven to respond without reflection. And I feel like that's just a part of sort of the commodification of our education and our society. And we have so little, much less resources, mentally, emotionally, etc. We're just driven to get a degree and become producer, consumer pods. And it feels like that's taken away the humanity of our education and our society at large. But I'm really looking forward to reading this book and reflecting on it, because
if I understand your story correctly, Ross, you're like such an interesting one-person natural experiment because the two parts of your college experience were separated by 30 years. Talk about how you've seen this more recent digital version. You called your original experience, an analog one in the 80s. How you saw this polarization and this instantaneous formulation of opinions and friends and enemies express. Can you describe it a little bit?
Well, things boil more quickly, it seems, in the digital age, where before it felt like, the people you were disagreeing with, you were kind of face to face, side by side, toe to toe. Now, a lot of the classes that I've taken have been all digital, and we don't spend time next to each other in person in all instances, having a face to face with the person who we might disagree with, so that our ideas are humanized and rooted in a personal experience. It's just words on a discussion board that we react to. We don't get to know the person we're disagreeing with in any kind of corporeal way.
And Ross, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for a really interesting call. Neil, what are you thinking as you listen to Ross?
What a wonderful way to put some of the changes and describe some of the changes that have happened to college. A really, really perceptive set of comments there. I'm reminded of a saying at Williams College, this very selective liberal arts college in Western Massachusetts. And for years there at Williams, a very small school, they described the ideal college experience as this former president of theirs from many, many years ago, Mark Hopkins, on one end of a log and the student on the other end of the log. And they're just having a conversation. They're having a debate. They're having a discussion. One of the things that's so great about the way higher education has been structured in the U.S. is that in its ideal form, that kind of discussion, immersion, that space to think things through, to disagree passionately, but to then understand that the person you're disagreeing with, is still a human who has, strong values and has come to their views for whatever reason they do. It's such a crucial thing. It's such a crucial formative period in the lives of so many people. And I agree with the caller that we've moved away from that in ways that are really damaging. And the more that I think higher education can return to those ideals, the better. It's interesting that recently some colleges have started going analog. That's a big part of their move. The University of Chicago, as of a couple of weeks ago, announced that in some of its social science classes, they would be all analog from here on out, with the use of technology effectively prohibited. And there's upsides to that and downsides to that. But the idea that we're reacting too quickly to people, reacting to what we think we're hearing people say, reacting to not what the actual person is saying, but to a stereotype of that person's position, that has been too much a part of the college experience, and is certainly something that we should try to counter.
Some listeners, might be thinking, hey, people have strong political beliefs. People tend to associate with people like themselves. That's not actually new, not at all new for human beings. Therefore, so what? Why is this self-sorting a bad thing?
I've heard that from some students in reaction to this argument, and the idea is that they want to be with people who are like them. They feel more comfortable with people like them, and so why shouldn't they be allowed to choose where they want to go? And at the individual level, that makes perfect sense. It makes sense that you're going to want to be friends with those who have similar views to you, and perhaps even to study a subject matter that resonates with you in terms of your values and your interests. So all that makes sense, and I understand why individual students and parents make those decisions.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, sorry. The broader issue is what happens at a societal level, right? When you start creating some schools that are effectively for kids on the left, others for kids on the right, others for kids in the center, or for don't engage in politics, we're not creating or nurturing citizens who know how to not only disagree with one another, but come to some compromised position. And in the absence of that, the future leadership of this country is going to be potentially no better than the leadership we're seeing now, and potentially far worse.
Cindy in Long Valley, New Jersey, has a story of her son's experience at college. Cindy, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. My son applied to many schools, Chicago's University of Chicago. His dad went there, Colby, Colgate, and he settled. Hamilton, was accepted. He's, had good grades, whatever. He ended up going to Vassar. Vassar was 2 hours away, so we could see him now and then. He was raised in a Democratic household, had helped in soup kitchens, clothes drives, had a variety of friends from all walks of life. A lot of his friends were first-gen kids. He got to Vassar, was always told, college is excellent, you're going to have a good time, open debate, open discussion, you'll hear ideas, play with them, talk with different people. It was just a real time for learning. And he went away a Democrat and came home a Republican. He was shut down, yes, like the only one in the House still to this day. And that's, he's been like that for about 3 or 4 years now. He told us some following things. He felt that the professors were not engaging in the way that they should. They would get very quiet if an ultra-liberal idea came up, and that the students coming up with the idea were super demonstrative about it, passionate about it. Sometimes people would raise their voices in an accusatory tone. And he said he saw basically professors just shutting down and being quiet. He learned later, as he was leaving from a professor he grew close with, that they were nervous about lawsuits and freedom of speech. He had a professor who had been born in India and asked an open question, stating that there are no vestiges of colonization left anymore in India. Remember, this is an 18-year-old in a first semester class.
Mm-hmm.
My son raises his hand and says, what about the fact that people speak English? Would that not be a vestige? Well, that was the wrong thing to say. The professor got very irritated, told him he was ignorant, had a lot to learn, and maybe needed to listen more.
But wouldn't that be
another?
I think you're just on that example, because it's really interesting. I think you were laying out a premise of that there was a lot of censorship from the left, that students who were demonstrative with progressive views wound up intimidating professors into not having open debate. But this example seems like the opposite, because arguing that there is still a vestige of colonialism in India, that would be a progressive point of view, but that one got shut down. I'm just trying to understand.
The point is, depending on the professor, if they had more moderate views, they would get shut down by the liberal students. If the professor was more liberal, they would shoot down a moderate student. Mm-hmm. So the affective and the division that your guest is talking about, it's all there, and you can see it in the school between a moderate, because Vassar is moderate to liberal. There's not a lot of conservatives there, but moderates there are thought to be ultra-conservative. As you've said many times on your show and had many guests, people don't understand the language. What was moderate 20 years ago is now considered liberal. Another professor was there, and this is when my son
Or it's
changed
more complicated than that on the segment we did recently on the word moderate, but I get your point. But the bottom line is your son went away more on the left, and rather than being intimidated by the college culture to be more solidly on the left, he experienced a backlash to what he saw as a censorious progressive culture and wound up more conservative, right?
Yes. And he said that the way because there was not open debate, and he thought there would be, and some tolerance of different conversations, he said that he feels like his education was hobbled by that.
Cindy, thank you so much for your call. Well, I'll bet you've heard some version of that before, but I don't know how frequently, Neil.
I have, and it's an unfortunate story. I heard many students. I spoke to, as I said, about 100 students with interviews, and then I surveyed and analyzed survey data on thousands more. And I definitely heard from a lot of students who'd had experiences like that. Most were moderates or conservatives who had attended more progressive institutions and felt that the student culture there had been censorious, as you said. This was especially so in 2020, 2021, in the aftermath of COVID, with the rise of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's murder. So it was particularly intense back then. And certainly there were some students who went in more moderate or liberal and moved to the right. One thing that's of interest, I think, and a ray of hope here, is that as I've talked to students in the last couple of years, something seems to have shifted. This micro-generation of students, many of them are also still on the left. It's the undergraduate culture is quite left-leaning in the U.S. today. But they are wary of that kind of cancel culture. Many students I talked to said that they thought that you couldn't learn anything if you shut down your opponents, and they didn't want to go to a college campus like that. So they're trying to push back and foster a different kind of culture. And today, when I talk to professors at schools around the country, they're concerned about something else, and that is especially professors who teach in more conservative states, their great fear is that they will say something that will be recorded by a conservative student who will then report that up to the state government or to the Trump administration, and that they'll then be subjected to lawsuits, or their school will be put under pressure because of what they said. So before there was some concern about censorship from the left, now there's more concern about censorship from the right. Neither of those makes for a good educational environment.
Shoshana in Boston. You're on WNYC. Did I say that right, Shoshana?
Yes, that's correct. So I am a recent graduate. I graduated this year from a university in the Boston area, and I was very involved in climate activism in high school and going into college. But then when the Israel-Palestine conflict broke out, there was a lot of disagreement amongst the climate activists at my school, and so basically our campaigns were supposed to overlap with the outbreak of the war, and so they wanted to find ways to merge our mission, and there were certain things that I was not comfortable with, a few other people weren't comfortable with, and I tried to organize get together talk about our mission and what we were going to do to move forward. And I even got a third party person to sit in from our international relations school that was trained in diplomacy, so that we could talk about how we as a club were going to move forward. And instead of being willing to talk with someone who might have a different perspective on the conflict, several of the leadership in the club chose to split and just quit the club. And basically the fallout from that took several years. They're now getting back on their feet. But instead of being willing to even sit in the same room, they chose to quit. And I thought that was very representative of my experience being on campus, of trying to foster spaces to talk, and people will not even sit in the same room because they think it's legitimizing your side.
What's the solution to this, in your opinion, or solutions, if you have any in mind, Shoshana?
I'm not sure. I think there needs to be more efforts to put people with different perspectives in the same room and have them talk in person, which I know my institution has been working on. But I really am not sure, because a similar thing played out when there were hearings with our student government with the conflict of the two sides had never talked before, and then it blows up because people are not willing to talk to the other side. So I'm open to hear what your guests would have to say on how we remedy that situation.
Shoshana, we'll give him that opportunity right now. We really appreciate your call. And Neil, and if you're just joining us, my guest is Neil Gross, who's a sociology professor at Colby College and has the new book, What Happened to College? How Politics Broke Higher Education and What We Can Do to Fix It. In fact, we're up against a break, so why don't we take that break and we'll keep Professor Gross till the end of the hour. We'll see if we can get to some more of your calls and texts, and we'll give him, a decent platform here to respond to Shoshana and say what he thinks can fix some of this polarization. And we'll also talk about this particular micro era of since the Israel-Gaza conflict, the version that started in 2023 affects all of this. So stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC with Neil Gross, sociology professor at Colby College, author now of What Happened to College, How Politics Broke Higher Education, and What We Can Do to Fix It. All right, the caller, Shoshana, was very interested to hear you on the What We Can Do to Fix It part of this polarization. Where would you start?
So my thoughts on this range from big to small. So on the big side, the first thing that colleges have to do is recognize that there's a problem. Recognize that, again, we've lost the trust and confidence of large segments of the population, and acknowledge that we have not offered students necessarily the kinds of educational experiences with regard to learning to disagree that they deserve. I think that is an important first step because from there other things can follow. One of those things, again, still in the large category, is to encourage more of the sorts of programs that your last caller described, which is programs that are specifically designed to try to get people together to have those conversations. We've got one of those at Colby. It's a program called In the News, and it brings together a large number of students every week for a conversation with a journalist, a newsmaker. We bring people in from both the left and the right, and the students there learn to have constructive dialogue with one another. There are programs like this popping up all over the country. This is at Colby, but there are programs of a similar nature happening at prominent schools like Harvard and Columbia, but at many other universities as well. And we need more of that. We need faculty to pay more attention to learning how to navigate those conversations and help students learn how to disagree better. That's really important. On the smaller side, there are other things that colleges can do. You know, when I went to college, most students were assigned roommates randomly, I think those who lived on campus. And that can be a really helpful thing if you are paired with someone who doesn't have the same views as you. That's something that you can do to counter affective polarization. You know, today, a lot of colleges have moved away from randomized roommate assignment. Many colleges allow their students to pick their own roommates, and when they do that, they often pick students who end up agreeing with them in major respects. Again, understandable why students would want to do that, but the more we can do as higher education institutions to put students who disagree in the same space and help them learn how to disagree better, I think the better we'll do at regaining the trust of the country.
Here's Vianna in Washington Heights, who I think had a mission as a college instructor and a certain experience in that respect that she wanted to share. Vianna, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Sure. Yeah, I felt it as my mission, as it were, not a single-handed mission or anything like that, but I was giving a class, this is many years ago, okay, I'm an old lady now. This is going back to the 70s, where I was doing Introduction to Peoples and Cultures of Africa. An anthropologist, and I became acutely aware of how the traditional curriculum would probably end up reinforcing some stereotypes that my students had. And why were my students? Why did they sign up for this class? You know, they were like most of them white, 18, 19, 20 years old. They were very curious about Africa, and they had very little information. And if I were just to teach them about some of the traditional cultures from the classical anthropological literature, they could end up with their same kind of racist, and we're all raised in this. We're all racist in one way or another, okay? We've just been raised in that culture. So, but I just knew it would end up reinforcing that. So I brought in addition, other aspects of the curriculum, such as my recent trip to Ghana. And I showed them the highways. I showed them, in addition, I mainly showed them the city, so I showed them the supermarket. Mm-hmm. And they were like shocked. They couldn't believe it. Then I also I knew that they were thought of racist. Now it's pretty commonly accepted that there's no such thing as separate, scientifically separate races genetically. But then it was like a brand new idea, like 50 years ago, okay? And so I had them do a reading that talked about the fact that they're just genetic differences are very gradual, and there's no separateness of these genetic configurations.
I'm going to jump in for time, Brianna, and ask you one follow-up question. You're describing your mission in the context of the class, in question, to counter racist assumptions among mostly white students. And you said we're all racist because we're brought up in that culture. I think you mean white people in the United States. That's the kind of thing that conservatives are experiencing backlash to because they hear that as, quote, woke, in the sense of, my professor is telling me I'm a racist, and I have to believe that. That doesn't feel right to me. What's your reaction?
My reaction is that nobody likes to be condemned and called bad in terms of their values and their ideas. That's very human. And I think that it's a mistake to approach it from that way, to condemning people. And that's too often what happens is some kind of coming from ideology, a blanket condemnation, like it's usually like I'm not, but you are kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that people, if people have, again, it comes back to diversity and what they're trying to do with mixing up the college students. If you're exposed to people from a different culture, a different ethnic background, different society, different social class, and as human beings, a lot of that stuff breaks down.
I hear you. Exposure helps break down stereotypes. Vion, I really appreciate you sharing your experience. Neil, we only have 2 minutes left in the segment, and I want to build on that by getting a reaction. I don't know if this happened before your book went to bed, but to what Yale did this year. They put out this Yale Committee on Trust in Higher Education report. They identified 3 problems: high costs, opaque admissions, and campus speech and political bias. And then they changed their mission statement. And I'm going to read the old and the new mission statement. The mission statement had been on had focused on improving the world through research, education, and global leadership. Improving the world. On fostering the intellectual, moral, and creative development of diverse, promising students to prepare them for leadership. And then they trimmed it in response to all this backlash to simply to create, disseminate, and preserve knowledge through research and teaching. In our last 45 seconds, is that an important example of something?
I think a lot of schools are following Yale's lead and trying to recognize that something went off the rails here, and we have to fix it. I don't know that colleges need to renounce the project of trying to make the world a better place. That's long been part of the aims of higher education and science. You do science to understand the world, and sometimes to try to make people's lives better.
Or including diversity, which Yale took out of its mission statement.
Sure. I don't have a particular stance on whether one should or should not do that, but I do think that Yale is taking an important step forward in saying, we need to do something different than we've done in the past. And to the extent that you can begin to build some common ground there between maybe folks on the center right or moderates who feel left out and those on the left who want to preserve a traditional image of academic life, that's good.
Leave it there with Neil Gross from Colby College, author of What Happened to College, How Politics Broke Higher Education, and What We Can Do to Fix It. Thank you so much.
Thank you.